Hello, this is Chance. I'm going to tell you about some of my absolute favorite homemade fishing lures today. In my opinion, these baits made by Burt Errett, who spent most of his life in Bellefontaine, Ohio, are true folk art. He didn't just make fishing lures, he really invested himself in a seriously creative way with innovation, creative metal parts added to carved wood, inspired creations that really were functional. Um, he was born in 1889. He passed away in 1952. He had one daughter who had these baits in her possession throughout her life. Collectors were able to get them um, quite a few years ago. They've been documented in Jeff Keeney's great Vintage Folk Art Fishing Lures and Tackle book, which is a must have book for anyone that finds themselves interested in the homemade type fishing lures. Jeff's collection really was cutting edge. It wasn't necessarily the biggest collection, it wasn't the first collection of folk art fishing tackle, but he cataloged it well, documented things, and he really spent a great deal of effort in documenting lures accurately. And I've really came to appreciate that when I acquired his book after it was published. These were also documented in an article in 2018 in our National Fishing Lure Collectors Club magazine by my friend Chris Olson. This article further documented the baits and really showed them in a positive way to our broader fishing lure tackle collecting community. This particular piece in front of me recently came into my collection. It's just really awesome. A lot of Eric's baits reference classic fishing tackle that was manufactured. This one would reference a creek chub Wee D. You see this metal plate that bends around the belly with the slots that the hooks are fit up inside of. Also has another metal plate at the rear, has these wire weed guards. In theory, you would be able to drag this bait through weeds in the water and not get hung up. He even has these little kind of hooks on the side that I have to assume he would have put some kind of maybe pork rind strip or some other piece of flexible material to make further action in the water. Errett really had interesting paint. They're splotchy, they're expressive, they're not painted in any sort of classical way, but the consistency in his baits, whether it's a wooden piece or a piece of metal that he's painted, is very consistent and very unique. So even though a lot of his pieces reference classic tackle manufactured fishing lures, they are very unique in their presence. And in my opinion, this particular piece here is probably one of the best fisherman made classic baits that there is. It's just a really cool piece. It's big and chunky, has some really cool parts. Here under the line tie is some kind of a stamped metal piece, probably from a vintage piece of jewelry, and even the eyes seem to be some kind of little, maybe a spacer in jewelry that has a pin stuck through it. You can see the screw where this metal's secured on. Really cool piece. Um, this is a neat one, kind of a bearded chunk, some kind of fur there on the underside. Speckly looking paint, has this little hand-shaped copper flasher and a kind of a funky feather dressed hook trailing behind. This thing would have a lot of movement in the water, and I imagine would definitely attract fish. Errett was an interesting man. He worked for the railroad for a living, but he spent a lot of time fishing and hunting. There's a cool photo. This is Errett over here on the right, and his brother, his father, and this is his daughter over here. A nice little stringer of fish that they've caught. We have to assume that maybe some of his fishing lures were made in here. This photo is dated 1918, and definitely looks like it's probably from that era based on the car and their clothing, and just a really cool classic photo. In addition to making the fishing lures, Errett made his own tackle boxes. They're really beautiful and finely crafted. He decorated bobbers. These were apparently made by the Ideal Company. They have this neat little brass sliding piece here, but he painted it, embellished it in his own way. There's, a pretty sizable group of bobbers out there. I only have a couple of them. His metal baits range from, really large size, which you'd think maybe a musky trolling or casting kind of spinning spoon kind of lure here. You can see the paint. It's very similar to the wooden pieces I've shown. Really neat. This one's completely handcrafted. You can see the rivets on there holding the fins on. There's a big hook trailing behind and this heavy wire leader with a big swivel out front. Here's another neat metal piece, hand formed with some playful paint. He wasn't afraid to get funky with them and use some found objects. He used quite a few parts of, spoons, dinnerware. This is some kind of a handle off of some kind of a serving spoon or something. I love the way he painted the back side of the spinner blade on this. It's really takes a nuanced touch to achieve that simple stroke of red on there. Really neat. His tying of the hooks is kind of crude, I guess. That one just has what looks like bucktail. But he's very consistent in the way that he achieved it. There's a couple of interesting metal pieces that were made from a 1950 and a 51 Logan County, Ohio dog tag. You'd have to register your dogs back in those days. And I think those are really neat pieces of history that he's repurposed into his fishing lures. So in the art world, in the early 20th century, artists were sampling from the found. They were less interested in just making stuff. They had all this mass-produced objects laying around, so why not incorporate them, repurpose them into your art? And so fishing lure makers, either by necessity or just, the simplicity of availability, they were led to do such a thing. And even the little spoon on this one looks like it was made from another such tag, but clearly it's cut. You can't possibly know what year that one's from. A few of them have, like production parts. This was an old Bing's minnow harness that a minnow would be attached on this wire. But he's taken a piece of what appears to be plastic, maybe a piece of jewelry or some kind of hair adornment, and fashioned a little simple minnow, and it's now attached to the wire. So this thing looks like we could still take it out today and cast it and attract some fish. This one is an old Al Foss bait that this little latch opens and you could secure a piece of trailing part. Probably had some rubber at one time, but it's broke off and it's left behind this cloth-like material. A really kind of neat thing. And then this was a Lockhart polywog. This was a production bait. It's actually a fairly rare piece, but he remade it, put these plastic flashers behind it. Even that looks like it would be attractive to a fish. Some more metal. I really love this spinner blade out here at the front. I suspect this was probably something he had, and he cut it into this kind of heart shape rather than leaving it at its full size. The main body spoon, he has that texture on it. Kind of an interesting piece. I like that trailing spinner behind. There's a few of these that are made. They look like spoons. This one was a piece of copper that he formed into looking like a spoon. This one actually was a big serving spoon. Makes you wonder if the handle off that one I showed might be the other part to this spoon right off the dinner table. There's this weird metal, I don't know if it's a weed guard or something that maybe he would have attached, something trailing behind it. Pretty neat piece. Spoons are really popular in the history of fishing lure making, so a dinner spoon already has the shape, so you might as well just reuse it. I think his wooden baits are really cool. This is one unfortunately missing the hooks, but it's kind of a skinny Rush Tango style piece. I like the size of it, and I love the paint. Unfortunately, a lot of them look like they probably were stored somewhere, in poor conditions. The paint got, stuck on, probably some kind of old varnish that kind of softened. The first two Errett baits I ever acquired, I was able to get them from Jeff at the 2015 NFLCC National Show in Springfield, Missouri, which was the first big lure show that I ever attended. And I was just thrilled to add these two pieces. They were thought to maybe be saltwater baits because he was known to have gone to the ocean and fished out there at certain times. You know, they definitely are big and chunky enough to be that they're heavy duty. You know, they're kind of based on vintage lures as well. I love this fluted wobbler kind of piece, kind of like what Wilson Hastings Company made. And but this is a very fat homemade version of it, and this big chunky bait's just neat. Look at the old paint on there. This one has beautiful paint. Look at that. This popper with a hook behind, just beautiful. Unfortunately, the paint has, you know, crawled away in a couple places on its other side, but it's still beautiful, beautiful here. Oop. And a lot of guys like this one. It's kind of references the vintage baby basser lure with this angled face and just kind of a cylindrical body. This one's interesting because it has these cuts under here, kind of like gills, or maybe it would add a little more action in the water. It has glass eyes. Interesting the way the hooks are rigged. Somehow the wire goes through the body. Not really sure where it starts and stops. Has a tack here that looks like it has some remnant, maybe of a rubber that probably had something trailing out. Maybe legs, or possibly, as some suggest, this may be a crawdad actually. So maybe they look like, you know, little pinchers. One of my favorites is this guy, and I'm not even sure what he's supposed to reference. I mean, I always think of it as like the old hound dog bait. He has this bent metal plate on this belly of his front end with these little painted flashers, little jointed rear end. You know, he's almost like a shrimp, maybe something like that. I just think it's a super cool piece. And you know, another wooden piece here. This is like a smaller version of the very classic Moonlight Ladybug Wiggler, which is a very collectible bait, which is a pretty big chunky piece. But this is kind of like a baby version of that, which I don't think they ever made. Maybe they did and I just don't know about it. But he just has that classic red and white paint. He didn't really go at it with his splotchy green striated and gold kind of look. But it definitely looks like it would attract some fish to it. He didn't just make big casting baits. He made some really cool fly rod bugs as well. And what I love about them, in addition to their paint and the funky feathers that he added, most of them have really unique faces painted on. I mean, look at those. Those are just really cool. You know, clearly a vintage, and you know, that one has that circle painted on the belly. And you know, he was very creative in the way he painted. And you know, some of his craftsmanship is a little on the crude side, but they're really interesting in the overall look of the collection. Like this minnow is really cool. It's just a piece of flat sheet metal that he cut out in the form of a minnow, shaped it just subtly, but then look at the paint with that just red and white. Super simple, but it just still seems like it could be relevant for going and attracting fish even today. I'm not going to do that with them, but they really seem to be honest in the intent. I really value pieces that are clearly made to fish with, where whoever was making them was going out and investing time and experimenting and practicing and testing and actually using them. I think that's really important in pieces that you know, matter the most to me for my collection. You know, there's quite a bit of information about these out there in that article and books and even on my blog. So if you want to learn more, there is more to learn. And stay tuned. I may do some more videos about Errett in the future. Thanks for watching.